Welcome to my guide for Zeromus Extreme, the final extreme trial of endwalker, otherwise known as the Abyssal Fracture. Like Barbarisha back in 6.2, this fight was designed to focus less on puzzles and more on mechanics requiring heavy movement. Similar to previous fights in endwalker, I highly recommend paying close attention to the normal mode version because almost every mechanic builds on things seen there. This guide is designed to be easy to approach to help players to get their first clear in Party Finder. It's not meant to be an optimization guide, but it may be useful as a foundation in building strategies for that. Now, while this fight doesn't heavily rely on markers, they can still help. I recommend setting clock positions for the party, which can be used to determine positions for a few mechanics later on. There are two things that are important to establish for this. One major mechanic will require splitting up into DPS and support groups, as well as establishing a left to right order for positioning within these groups. Party Finder has mostly settled on using Tank 1, Tank 2, Healer 1, Healer 2 from left to right in that order. Likewise for DPS, Melee 1, Melee 2, Range 1, Range 2 from left to right also in that order. While we can use clock spots to determine who is 1 and 2 for these roles, some parties may opt for placing markers on the ground to confirm the left to right order anyway. I do see alternative orders being used sometimes, so be sure to know what your party is using. The other major position-based mechanic involves sending pairs to each corner of the arena. For this, you should have 2 melee pairs with 1 tank and 1 melee DPS in each north corner, and 2 range pairs in the south corners with a healer and range DPS in each. Players can easily use their light party size and roll to determine their corner, but again, some parties may opt to use markers to determine these spots as well. For the arena, you can use the markers that I show here. The fight starts off with Abyssal Nox. This is a heal check mechanic which drops the party's HP down to 1 and places a doom on each player. This will kill a player if their HP isn't restored entirely before the debuff runs out. Keep in mind that this must be health and not shields. Healers, make sure to watch your tanks because they'll need more healing than everyone else to be topped off in time. Immediately after this, the center of the arena will start to glow and shoot lights out in lines towards the outer edges of the arena. After a delay, the end of these lines will explode with large circle AoEs. After this, a second set of AoEs will go off on any part of the arena that was previously safe. Move to one of the initial spots that just had an AoE to dodge this. Abyssal Nox will appear multiple times throughout the fight and will be handled in the exact same way each time. Next up is Sable Thread. One player will be marked with the line stack marker. When the cast finishes, Zeromus will attack the party repeatedly with a laser beam. The first 2 targets in the line will be hit harder than anybody else, so your tank should be at the front. The beam will hit 6 times and is a great candidate for skills like Lilybell and Panheima. Party mitigation will also help a ton here. Healers should try to top off tanks after the stack damage is completed because the boss will cast Dark Matter next, which is a 3-hit AoE tank buster that targets both tanks. The 2 tanks should move away from the party to the east or west corner to avoid overlapping damage. It isn't a ton of damage, so mitigate appropriately. Next up is Visceral Whirl. The boss will cover the arena in its tentacle claws, preparing to damage it with huge AoEs. There will always be 2 triangular shaped save spots to stand in, one in the northern half of the arena and one in the south. After the claw AoEs go off, you will notice 3 purple glowing X-shaped marks on the ground. Each X mark will expand into large X-shaped line AoEs following the shape of the X that extends the length of the arena. To resolve this, you must find a safe spot where the line AoEs do not overlap. Like the previous mechanic, there will always be 2 safe spots. What you need to know is that the safe spot will always be on the opposite side of where you are standing to dodge Visceral Whirl. I'll show you the different patterns and their safe spots now. As long as one person knows where to go, there's enough time to follow them if you're not sure, but I suggest studying up on the pattern so that you don't have to rely on someone else. Next, Zeromus will cast Flare, which spawns 2 large towers in the northwest and southeast corners of the map. We want 4 players in each tower. For this mechanic, we split into 2 groups with melees handling the north tower and range in the south to maintain uptime. After the tower is soaked, a fire orb will linger on each tower, so move away to avoid taking damage. Shortly after, each orb will have lines projecting out indicating large line AoEs that will shoot out from each orb. Like the earlier mechanics, you must find the safe spot where the lines do not overlap. This can often be in the center, but it may have you standing in the center of the northeast quadrant or the east edge of the northeast quadrant. The lines will expand a lot from the initial size of the telegraph, so take care to not get clipped. After this, Zeromus will cast Void Bile, which will place a bunch of green orbs at the north of the arena. Immediately after, the boss will cast Visceral Whirl again. In a random order, these green poison orbs will slowly begin to move south. You have to dodge these while also making your way to a safe spot. Aside from the new orbs to dodge, the mechanic will be exactly the same as before. Refer to earlier in the video if you need a refresher on the possible patterns, because they're the same here. If a player is hit by an orb, they will gain a very strong damage over time effect that is likely to kill the player. It is possible to save a player hit by this if both healers can react quickly enough, but try not to rely on this. Once this is all over, the boss will cast Big Bang. This comprises of a bunch of random circle AoEs on the ground, in addition to spread AoEs in each player. While these spreads don't hit too hard, you'll want to heal and shield shortly after they go off, because the boss will then hit the party with big raid-wide damage that also places a dot on each player. The dot ticks can kill players if not mitigated and healed thoroughly. Now that the arena has been transitioned into space, Zeromus will cast Void Meteor. A bunch of proximity AoEs will appear, signaling meteors that are about to land. The party can safely stand in the center to take minimal damage. If you haven't noticed the effect spinning around your character, this is a good time to mention that all members of the party were given various debuffs, so it's a good time to look at those because they'll be going off after the next mechanic. And now we get to the highlight mechanic of the fight, Meteor Impact. Let's break it down. This is what our support and DPS group orders from earlier are for. There are a few things to manage here. 4 players will be marked with proximity tether lines coming from the south. The players will either be all supports or all DPS. After a delay, Zeromus will shoot meteors at each player with a line. Any player standing in a meteor's travel path will die. The meteor will stop once it hits the marked player. If the meteor overlaps with any existing meteor, the party will wipe. The tether line is really helpful because it shows the size of the meteor and changes colors from blue to red if the meteor path is going to overlap. This means that if you see red, you need to adjust your position. No matter what else, you must not have any red lines. Once the meteor is starting to fire, you won't be able to move, so you have to adjust accordingly before this happens. Secondly, the tether will also kill the player if they aren't far enough from the south of the arena. You can tell when you're a safe distance away because the inner line of the tether will change from purple to yellow. If it's still purple, you're too close. The reason we have the order is because this is how we want to space out our meteors. Each player should try to get their meteor as close as possible to the north without overlapping. This is because not long after the first 4 tethers appear, the other 4 players will then be marked. Their meteors will be shot after the first group is finished. This means that each player in the first group has to make sure that they are leaving room for the next group to also place their meteors. This is why it's critical to get it as close as possible to the north. Following the order from earlier, left to right, we position Tank 1, Tank 2, Healer 1, Healer 2. Same goes for Melee 1, Melee 2, Range 1, Range 2. While there are specific patterns for this, I don't think that the mechanic is complicated enough that players need to study each one. You have more than enough time and space to place each meteor, and using the left to right order should make things easy enough. Something important to keep in mind is that it's only a wipe if a meteor overlaps. If the previous group placed their meteors poorly, which can happen in Party Finder prog parties, it's better to die than to let your line stay red. It's very easy to recover from a death or two here, so focus on keeping your line blue above all else, even if you'll die because you're too close. Just don't overlap your meteor. Once all the meteors have been placed, they will all detonate with mildly large AoE, so stand in the center to avoid taking damage, as well as to prepare for the next mechanic. Next up is Visceral Whirl. This time, however, while Visceral Whirl is the same, those debuffs from earlier are about to go off, in addition to the new chains we just got. The chains need to be handled first. This is why we stood in the center at the end of the meteors, because you need enough distance to break the chains. Remember now that Visceral Whirl will always have 2 safe spots, one in the north and one in the south. We will split players up between these 2 spots to break the chains. Conveniently, the chains will always tether to 1 support and 1 DPS. To keep damage uptime for melees, the DPS group should take the north safe spot while the support should head south. Notice that your debuff timers are really close to wearing off, which means that their effects will happen. First, all players have to handle their acceleration bombs. Like every other instance of this debuff, you must be standing still and not attacking when it wears off, or you will take damage. Keep in mind that Visceral Whirl will still leave the X-shaped marks on the ground again, so you'll have to move to the safe spot for this once the acceleration bombs go off. A few seconds after this, the Divisive Dark debuff will activate, creating small circle AoEs around each player. Create distance from each other the moment that Visceral Whirl is finished so that you don't overlap the AoEs with other players. After this, there should be 3 players with debuffs remaining. One will be marked with Beckoning Dark, which is a stack marker. 2 DPS will be marked with Forked Lightning, which will create a small AoE around the player. While all this is happening, the 2 tanks will also have to deal with another Dark Matter Tank Buster. Tanks will take these to their respective northern corners to avoid hitting the party. The player with the stack marker can stand in the center, and the players marked with Forked Lightning should stand away from the party and the tanks. All other players should stand in the middle to soak the stack damage. Once all this is over, Zeromus will begin to cast Black Hole and Fractured Eventide. Like in normal mode, this mechanic revolves around a giant laser beam sweeping across the arena, as well as a black hole that will instantly kill any players that touch it as it grows in size to cover most of the arena. The twist in Extreme is that one player will be marked with the Defamation marker, which will place the black hole where they are standing. The safe spot to stand for this will be near the corner that Zeromus starts the beam in. Zeromus will always face towards the starting point before the beam appears. You'll want to stand on the side of the beam that is closest to the edge. Placing the black hole here will give you more than enough time to run away while maintaining uptime. Your position should look like this. As the beam travels, Run with it without running into it to avoid getting sucked into the black hole. I've seen some stuff about people wanting to place it south to then be rescued through the beam to the safe side, but I personally don't want to promote a strategy that risks players getting a Vuln stack, especially when it's not necessary at all to dodge the mechanic. While there are definitely other strategies going around, I found this to be pretty simple and reliable for your average party finder group. Save the fancier stuff for optimization runs. After the black hole is finished, Zeromus begins to cast Big Crunch, which works exactly the same as Big Bang. Dodge the AoEs and mitigate accordingly. Once the arena has returned to normal, the boss will proceed to use Abyssal Nox and Sable Thread again. These work almost exactly the same as before, except Sable Thread hits 7 times instead of 6 now. Next up, we have 2 towers appearing. Zeromus will either cast Branding Flare or Sparking Flare. Pay attention to these move names. We split into light parties to soak the towers. Mitigation or healing is helpful here because everyone will be hit with unavoidable damage shortly after soaking the towers. Immediately after, if you remember those pairs we set up at the start, now is the time to break into those quadrants. If you're having trouble remembering, you should be in the quadrant on the side of your light party. Ranged jobs will be in the south and melee jobs will be in the north. Each tower will turn into a fire orb that shoots line AoEs in all 4 cardinal directions, just like the previous towers. This means that each quadrant will be nicely blocked off by a line AoE. If the boss uses Sparking Flare, all players should spread away from each other to avoid overlapping an untelegraphed spread AoE that will happen to every player. You have plenty of space to avoid each other. Just stay away from the center of either edge to not get hit by the fire. If the boss uses Branding Flare instead, the players should stack together to mitigate a 2-person stack attack on each pair. While all this is happening, 2 players get marked with chasing AoEs. These will be gigantic purple orbs that follow you slowly, hitting 5 times. You want to make sure to place this in the corner at the start. As soon as the AoE for this appears, run towards one of the other corners. There typically isn't a set direction, but running to another corner will keep you safe. Since you may sometimes run into the situation where 2 players with the chasing AoE are running at each other, one should try to correct by turning and heading in the other direction. This can create an awkward pattern for the party, but you want to avoid overlapping the orbs. The party can stand in the center to dodge these, but pay attention in case someone accidentally runs this into the party. Committing to running in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction can help with the chasing AoEs, but I see most parties winging this, so it's good to know what to do in this situation. After this, Zeromus will mix in all of the previous mechanics from this phase, including Void Bio, Dark Matter, Sable Thread, and another sequence of towers until you get its HP to around below 30%, which will initiate a transition into the final phase of the fight by casting Rend The Rift. Rend The Rift itself does raid-wide damage to the entire party. After the arena transitions, many baited ground AoEs will appear while Zeromus will prepare to cast Nostalgia. The ground AoEs are small and delayed enough that most parties shouldn't need a specific strategy to bait these. Just dodge as best you can. Once Nostalgia is casted, Zeromus will punch the ground 4 times, dealing small raid-wide damage each time. It will then follow up with 3 screams doing raid-wide damage with extra damage on the last scream. Mitigate and heal appropriately. Next up is Flow of the Abyss. A huge line will shoot across the arena from west to east, hitting 1/3 of the arena. You can see where this line will be by looking to the west of the arena, where Zeromus will be shooting out a small beam from its chest. While this line happens, the party will have to deal with either a stack, 4 enumeration pairs, or spreads. For the stack, it's easy enough to just stack in the center of the safe areas. For the enumerations, 4 players will be marked with blue circles. If these blue circles don't have 2 people in them when they go off, the marked player will die. For these, we just have each of the quadrant pairs standing together. You should be with the same person that you stood with for the branding and sparking flare. For the positions, we can roughly use the same position ordering that we established for meteors. For the spreads, they will leave lingering AoEs that you must run out of after the initial hit. After this, Zeromus will cast Chasmic Nails. This attack involves cleaving the arena in 5 cone-shaped AoEs in an order that is telegraphed during the cast time. At the same time, another Flow of the Abyss laser beam will shoot across part of the arena, in addition to more baited ground circle AoEs appearing under the players. The same cone will never be hit twice, so a safe way to resolve this is to stand next to a cone that will get hit first and then move into it once the AoE has gone off. Just make sure to do this in a part of the arena that isn't being hit by the laser beam while also dodging the ground AoEs. Healers should know that if a player is hit by one of the cone AoEs, it isn't lethal, but it will leave a damage over time effect on the player that can be cleansed with the Suna, so try to do that as soon as possible if someone is hit. At this point, you've seen every mechanic, and they will just happen in different assortments until Enrage happens. Zeromus will alternate between Flows of the Abyss, Chasmic Nails, and Nostalgias until you kill it, or it wipes the party with Enrage. If you enjoyed this, be sure to leave me a comment with any feedback, as this is my first time making a guide. I'm happy to answer any questions in my Discord as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next video.